Let's welcome Blanche from Saledo. It's just that I hear so many of them, you know. Everywhere I go, people are dying to tell me. My name is Blanche, and I am a member of a worldwide fellowship called Al-Anon. Hi. And I have been a member of the Al-Anon family groups since July 7th, 1964. But I have been addicted to mood-changing, mind-altering men ever since I can remember. "29 years makes me a survivor, not a savior. I have to remember at all times that I am one person away from an obsession. I am glad to be here. There was a little while at O'Hare last night that I wasn't sure I was going to make it. We ran a few hours late, let me put it that way. I do appreciate so much the warm hospitality. It's an honor to be invited to share Al-Anon. And I have a special place in my heart for Pennsylvania. I don't think I've ever told this before from a podium, Nell. And when I was delegate to World Service, I went up a little apprehensive about Yankees. Now, I'm sorry. I was fortunate to grow up in a home where there was never any ill will allowed for race, religion, ethnic background, but with my mother's milk, I got this thing about Yankees, and they did not think they were prejudicing me. They thought they were explaining life to me as it is. So when I went to New York, I went with a little apprehension, and the first delegate with whom I felt rapport and connected was the one from Pennsylvania. And yes. We became fast friends. I visited her in Pittsburgh several times. She flew to Texas and visited me. And I learned to love Pennsylvania by having her drive me around and explain that whereas parts of Texas are beautiful, all of Pennsylvania is beautiful. And it is. I haven't seen any part that isn't. I have been trying for a number of years now, when I'm allowed to share Al-Anon in various places, to be as open and as honest as I know how to be. See, it would be easier for me to talk about the program than about myself. It would be easier for me to tell you what I think than how I feel. And sometimes when speakers lecture, the audience isn't aware of the difference, but I became aware after about 10 years of doing it because I wasn't reaping the benefits that come from sharing what is inside me with you. And so I decided that although that is scary, and it leaves me very vulnerable up here, very emotionally naked, I want to do it because I want to share with you, and I don't want to lecture to you. I learned that that which does not come from the heart does not reach the heart, and I very much want to reach your hearts tonight, so I will talk to you from mine. And since you have taught me that it's all right to ask for what I need, I will need you loving me back. While I'm talking, please. I came here to participate in your weekend, not to perform. And by the way, I never talk without using notes. If you have a problem with that, I suggest you call your sponsor and discuss acceptance. Yes, I know God can tell me what to say, but I don't think He's limited to doing that the minute I step up here. I have known for nearly a year that I was coming. So I trust that what He told me long ago, months ago, is what He wants me to say. Actually, it's for my security. It's like having the music in front of you, you know. And sometimes I adhere to them pretty rigorously, and sometimes I don't. It is hard to vary your story if you're telling it a couple of times every month somewhere. And I would rather you leave here thinking, what a marvelous program, than what a marvelous speaker anyhow. The message is far more important than the messenger. I came into Al-Anon kicking, screaming, clutching my halo, wrapping my robes of righteousness about me, and protesting to everyone that I was fine, thank you. I had not done the drinking and I did not need the therapy, and I see I can't say that with a straight face tonight, but I believed it then. I am so grateful that God led me to a group of people who were serious about recovery. What I know of Al-Anon principles tonight, I know because they were practiced lovingly and tenderly on me, not because I read them somewhere or somebody told me about them, but because I saw them in action. This was a group of people who loved me when I was unlovable, and who forgave me when my behavior was pretty nearly unforgivable. I was patronizing and condescending, and they loved me anyway. They loved me until I could love myself. And they're the ones who began to tell me, when I could hear them, what Al-Anon is. It is not a ladies' auxiliary. It is not a stitch and bitch club. They told me it was not a coffee klatch. And you may not have this problem in Pennsylvania, but we do in Texas, so I have taken to mentioning it. There are well-meaning members of AA, and I think they truly have not thought it through, who refer to the non-alcoholics in their family as Al-Anons. Some of them are, but sometimes that's like referring to a still drinking alcoholic as a member of AA. An Al-Anon is a member of an Al-Anon family group who attends meetings regularly, studies the literature, has a sponsor, works the steps. If you hear anyone else talking about it, don't listen. Those people are uninformed. They are not carrying the message, they are spreading the disease. So I learned that we were not cookie bakers and coffee makers, and above all, we were not AA groupies. We never have purported to be a therapeutic tool for the treatment of alcoholism. And Al-Anon does not promise to save marriages, only sanity. And I thought both of those were in fine shape when I got to you. Happily ever after, I have learned, may not mean walking hand in hand into the sunset together. Happily ever after means my personal recovery. And so I have a success story to share with you tonight, because this program is for me. An analogy I always use is that of my mother's illness and death. We had been with you a year. She was 58. That's not young, but it's young to die. And we were very close, and I thought I could not stand it. I was in Texas. She was in Florida. I flew home 4 times the last 6 months of her life, and the very last time I was there, I knew it would be the last time. I had stepped out into the hall because I was crying. A woman in the room across the hall, whom I have never seen before or since, I don't know how she knew who I was, but she beckoned me into her room and she said, "Your mother's going to be all right." And I said, "Oh, you don't understand. Her illness is terminal." And she said, "I didn't say she's going to get well. I said she's going to be all right." And my mother did not get well, and she has been all right ever since. Now, it's very much as if, when I got to you, it's very much as if you had said, "You're going to be all right." And if you had, I would have said, "Oh, you don't understand. I have a barely sober husband." And you would have said, "I didn't tell you you'd have a sober husband. I said you're going to be all right." Or I would have said, "I have a very fragile, sick marriage." And you would have said, "I didn't promise you a marriage. I said you're going to be all right." Because somehow that's what I heard. And I have been. You know, and better than that, I know that I will be. Everything else you've told me has been true. So I'm counted on that one too. Our literature tells us how to make an Al-Anon talk. I intend to memorize it in a year now, but I haven't yet. It says, Al-Anon talks can be, and too often are, merely a repetition of past or present sorrows. Sketching the background is important and has its place, but it's merely the foundation of the talk. The best talk, the one that helps the most people to the highest degree, is the one that brings out just how the program works and just how the speaker follows it. A good talk may be divided into 3 parts: how sick I was, how well I am, what helped me to get well. Of these 3, the emphasis should be on what helped me to get well. And that's unquote. I've always agreed with Father Martin, who says when he's sitting out there and you're up here, he says, "You're playing with my life. Don't tell me how sick you were without telling me how well you are." And so I hope to spend the majority of the minutes I have with you tonight telling you what helped me to get well. I was born on Christmas Day on my grandmother's farm in northeast Florida, just below the Georgia border. In the year of our Lord, well, I actually no longer say which one. I have reached the point where I not only lie about my age, but I forget what I said that it was. I am somewhere between Blue Lagoon and on Golden Pond, okay? I am not old, I'm chronologically challenged. My family had been in Florida 4 generations. When I was born, we were not tourists. Tourist was a bad word. Anytime I behaved in a manner my mother considered inappropriate, she'd say, "Don't act like a tourist." There are still things I cannot do and things I cannot wear, because that's what tourists did and wore. We lived in Jacksonville until I was 10. That's on the Atlantic coast, and it's on the Georgia border. Northern Florida is southern, and southern Florida is northern, in case you ever go there. That strip across the top was very, very much the Deep South. I had an alcoholic father whom I adored, and he was unfortunately violent. This was during the Depression. I was never, thank God, sexually abused, but I was a badly battered child. It was many years before I could say that at a microphone, and it needs saying. It is not that uncommon in alcoholic homes. And let me say quickly, it's not always the alcoholic who does the battering. It happened to be that way at my house. We lived in grinding and abject poverty. Poverty has nothing to recommend it. It does not ennoble the human character. It is a debasing and a degrading way to live, and I hope you will fight it with your checkbook and your vote and any other way you possibly can. And particularly, it's not the fault of the children. I don't mean no luxuries. I mean nothing to eat for days on end. I mean very substandard living conditions. But even where we had to live, the neighborhood children were not allowed to play with me. I know now that their parents were understandably apprehensive about what was going on at my house. But I didn't understand that as a little girl, and I felt rejection and rage. I could not have verbalized it. When you're 5 or 6, you know, you don't have that vocabulary yet, but somewhere deep within me, I took on this role that happens in alcoholic homes of, they will, by golly, respect me. And I found a way to get back at them. At our neighborhood school that we all attended, I could beat the socks off of them, and I did, and I relished every minute of it. My motives were not good, but there was a good byproduct, because I fell in love with learning, and I have never fallen out of love with it. To this day, nothing excites me more than a new idea. And the older you get, the fewer of them there are, you know. My parents divorced when I was 8. And when I was 10, my mother remarried a man that, as it happened, didn't drink at all. We were not close, he and I, but he adored my mother, and that's all I really asked of him. And so we had a bond between us through our love for her. There were still no luxuries, but the necessities were there, and college was considered a luxury. So when the time came, that's how I went to Texas. I investigated. I read, We didn't have counselors in our schools then, so I had to do it on my own. And the two best English departments in the South were Baylor in Texas and Duke in North Carolina. I knew who was teaching there. I knew what they had published. I did the research. And I chose Baylor because the Texas people in Pensacola, where we lived from the time I was 10 until I married, and that's what I think of as my hometown, the Navy people there who were from Texas spoke of it as if that's where good people went when they died. And I thought, well, I haven't ever been there. I'll go take a look. And so my mother said, all right, if you want to go to college in Texas, there are a few things I need to remind you of. One is that you'll have to pay for it yourself. And this is, and it still is, a very expensive private university. And she said, make up your mind that you'll spend the rest of your life out there, because she said you'll end up marrying a Texan and they don't transplant. I told her I was going to do no such thing, but I did, and they don't, and I have, and so what can I tell you? I worked a year between high school and college. I worked at college. I worked every summer. I had one loan and one scholarship, and I went through on the narrowest shoestring you have ever seen. And I stayed in Texas. Now, you surely know that Texas is a state of mind. They have never forgotten that they were a nation, and this is the kind of pride that they feel. Until January of this year, I worked in the public schools. I was a teacher and then a counselor. That comes out a little later. But in the elementary schools in Texas, after the boys and girls pledge allegiance to the American flag, in most of the schools they turn and pledge allegiance to the Texas flag. I used to think that was a bit much, but I have decided that it's all right to love where you live. I hope you love where you live. I love where you live. And there's nothing wrong with that kind of loyalty. We have, by the way, a governor and a lieutenant governor now in Texas who are, by their own admission, recovering alcoholics. My husband says that makes everyone in the state of Texas eligible for Al-Anon. We are all being influenced by somebody's alcoholism. I know, of course, now that it was inevitable that I marry an alcoholic. But I tried not to. I want you to know that. I didn't want to suffer the way I had seen my mother suffer. And so I just didn't date anyone who drank. Now, that wasn't too hard at Baylor. It's like a Baptist convent, kind of. But if you drank, you were sent home. And when I married Charles, I'd never seen him take a drink. He didn't drink at all. But we still had matching illnesses, matching neuroses. We nourished them in each other for a very long time. I didn't have any feeling of self-worth by just living. I felt worthwhile when I rescued and managed and controlled and took care of. And so, of course, I found someone who would give me an opportunity to do that on a regular basis. When I got to you, you said it didn't matter whether he was drinking or not, that that's only a symptom of alcoholism. You said it's as if he had had tuberculosis and he had not yet started hemorrhaging. And because he wasn't hemorrhaging, I assumed he didn't have the disease. And I believe that. Of course, I found someone who was alcoholic. I know now that sick people marry sick people, and they rear sick children, and I hope you won't let anyone tell you anything different. I was one of those kids. I worked with thousands of them in the schools. I reared 2 of my own. I haven't found any exceptions to that. We lived in Corpus Christi a year, then in San Antonio for 4 years, which is the most beautiful city in Texas. If you're ever there, don't miss San Antonio. Our babies were born there. It's very special to me. Then we moved out to West Texas, to my husband's hometown, Odessa. It was named for the city in Russia by Russian railroad workers. It doesn't look anything like the one in Russia, which is a seaport. It is on the desert in West Texas, and the landscape is somewhat like that of the moon. My mother used to call it desolate. She thought I had moved to the end of the world. I had to learn not to let my happiness depend on a tree, and I'm very serious. I just couldn't give a tree that much power. I never learned to like the dust and the sandstorms, but I loved those people. West Texas people don't know there's anything they can't do, and so they do it. And I'm very grateful that that's where we got our sickest, because that's where we found you. And the people there had a strong, active program for us to go into. Looking back, I know that there were slogans that I lived by before you taught me some better ones. I wonder if you had any of these. One of mine was, what will people think? Yeah. How about don't rock the boat? Or it's not that bad yet? Did you ever play Guess What I'm Mad About? Charles used to say I could ask him a question, answer it myself, and go away mad. See, we were blindsided by alcoholism. I didn't see it coming. He went from very casual, occasional drinks to blackouts within 5 years, and I was dumbfounded. I had never run across anything in my life that I couldn't handle, and I didn't know what to do about this. So I did all the wrong things, of course, and I kept on doing them. That's the dumb thing. I used to have a cleaning woman who, like everyone in Texas, loves football. Well, that's an understatement. It is second only to oxygen in Texas. And so when she was ironing, in football season, she watched football on TV, but she never caught on to instant replay. And she would say, maybe this time he'll catch it. And I used to listen to her, and I thought, that's what I was like. You know, it had never worked before, but hey, maybe this time. So I kept on doing them. I played Let's Pretend as diligently as he drank. I protected him. I rescued him. I lied for him. He was almost literally loved to death, and that can happen. I know that you know if an Al-Anon is drowning, someone else's life flashes in front of her eyes. That is a real obsession. I would like you to think that I stayed with him out of love and loyalty, but I did not, and when I'm this far from home, I have to explain a little bit. I mentioned that the northern strip of Florida was Alabama and Georgia. It really was, just a little farther down. And in my generation, women in the Deep South were given a very specific kind of upbringing. We were expected to flutter our eyelashes and flash our dimples and swish our skirts, but it was understood that we were made of steel and we could cope. And one did not air one's dirty linen in public, and you didn't live with a man and criticize him to other people. I was taught some other things that might amuse you. And you know, they weren't all wrong. They just didn't go quite far enough. I was taught, keep the men happy and everything else falls into place. But no one added, it's up to you not to give up big chunks of your personhood to do that. No one knew that then. I was taught by precept and example. Blanche Marie, repeat after me. We are ladies in the parlor, wizards in the kitchen, hussies in the bedroom. Nothing wrong with that, except that nobody said it's up to you to see that your needs are met. Nobody else has the assignment of making you happy. And so it was an interesting kind of upbringing. We were poor but proud. Even in the worst years of the Depression, when we were living in that very blighted area of Jacksonville, we had cloth napkins. They were patched, but we had them. And so I was a steel magnolia long before there was a play and a movie by that name. And as I said, it's not all bad, but the fact that one didn't air one's dirty linen in public and that you didn't talk about anything that was bothering you. That kept me sick a very long time. So my solution was to try harder. You get the Charlie Brown cartoons up here. I'm sure his little sister Sally is learning long division. She says, how many times will 24 go into 12? And he says, 24 won't go into 12. And she says, it will if you push. That was my thinking. By golly, I'd fix it one way or the other, and of course I didn't. I had a lot of self-righteousness. See, I had had a very inauspicious beginning. And I had attended an expensive university and paid for it myself. I had married the man I wanted, and he was handsome and brilliant and charming. I had the children I wanted when I wanted them. I had a career that I loved and did well. And I didn't understand people who messed up their lives. I mean, I could match, childhood sob stories with any of them. And my thinking was if I could cope, so could they. I had no tolerance of nor understanding of people who couldn't cope. My sponsor didn't quite have me write it on the blackboard 100 times, but she used to have me repeat, we are not morally superior to sick people, over and over and over. I did a few things right during the worst of those years. I never called Charles a drunk. I never thought of him that way. I was married to a very fine man who drank too much, who had what my Irish grandmother called the failing. At some level, I knew he was sick. At least I knew he wouldn't be that way because he wanted to be. And even during those years, I had a God whom I worshiped and served. Not God as I understand him tonight, but I hope that if I get another 29 years with you, I'll have an understanding of God that has deepened and broadened too. And I had a doctor back then who was my Al-Anon before I found you, and I say that because he was the one who would say to me, you have to do whatever's necessary for your sanity and your serenity regardless. And he knew just which button to push. He would say, your children really need one stable parent. Well, need was the operative word. If you needed me, I was putty in your hands. I still react to that word pretty strongly. And it was this doctor who suggested I return to teaching. I had taught before my children were born. But back then, a good mother didn't work outside her home. And that is so strange now. But they didn't. And it didn't occur to me. I mean, I was following all the rules. So he wrote on a prescription pad that I should return to teaching. Now, I am not a spontaneous person. I wish that I were. I thought about it for a year. I have worked my way up to flexible, but I will never make frivolous. And I did return to teaching. I taught high school juniors. I taught English in a very fine, very affluent, very large high school in Odessa. And I absolutely loved it. I had missed doing it. I loved being home with my children, but I was trained in a profession, and I think if you are and you don't practice it, there is that loss there. There are people who have suggested that 150 17-year-olds every day would not constitute therapy. There have been people who suggested that if you weren't already sick, that would do it. And most of the time when I talk, I remember to say, don't criticize kids to me. I think I know more of them than you do, and I'm saying that very gently. I've accumulated several thousand through these years. Now, it was not one long honeymoon, no. There were days when I wished for retroactive birth control, but not usually. Charles never quit trying to find an answer. We didn't know what was wrong because he didn't drink the way my alcoholic father had. He didn't go to bars. He didn't drive drunk. He drank at home until he passed out. Really, he used to say it was a very dull story, that he never had any fun drinking. And as far as I know, he never did. So we didn't suspect alcoholism. We suspected mental illness and a lot of other things. And he went through our 2 local psychiatrists very quickly. He went to ministers. He went to lay counselors. He went to medical doctors. He went through clinics. Nobody knew. And finally, a woman who was doing counseling, a psychologist in Odessa at that time, suggested to him, she was the strangest lady, eccentric. His first appointment with her was at 12:30 a.m. Now that'll give you a clue. He was there, he kept it. That'll tell you something about him too. I'm sure there are moments in your life that are so graced, so lucid, that you remember every detail of them. I remember every detail of this January in 1964 when she called me. I was home from school for the Christmas holidays still. When she told me her name, I recognized her, of course, and she said, your husband is an alcoholic. This is a family illness. I need to talk to you too. And all of my lady in the parlor, deep south upbringing went out the window, and I said, you're out of your mind, and hung up. Now, I was not brought up that way. I was brought up that if you don't like somebody, you are kind but cool. And I was not either of those words in any of their meanings. Before I could leave the room, the phone rang again. When I picked it up, she didn't even wait for me to say hello. She said, don't hang up. I know what you've been through. Well, she couldn't know. I hadn't told anybody. And I thought all the tears had long since been shed, and I stood there with that phone in my hand, and I cried, and I cried, and I cried. That was your first gift to me before I ever got to you, was the freedom to cry. I cry anytime I please now. Charles used to say I could cry reading telephone directories or menus. No, but supermarket openings are rather touching. I cry at the Kodak commercials, you know. What can I tell you? At the Olympics, no matter who wins, when they play his national anthem, I'm just bawling. And I always cry in historical places. When I was taken through the battlefield here, I started crying when the bus started, and I cried the whole time. It was just, what could I tell you? When we lived in San Antonio, we had a great many guests because people loved to go to San Antonio, and I could qualify as a guide through the Alamo. And from the minute we stepped into it, I would start crying. It's just really embarrassing. But I do it because you said it was all right. This was this counselor who sent us to you. And for 6 months, I went only to open AA meetings. And if anyone had the questionable judgment to invite me to Al-Anon, I was kind but cool. And I explained that I had not done the drinking and I didn't need the therapy, and I thought they should understand that. In July of that year, we went to San Antonio for the 4th of July weekend. And Charles got drunk, and he said, I must always tell you it was not a slip, that it was carefully planned drunk. It was not the worst one nor the longest one, and I know now that I did not expect him to stay sober. That must have helped him a lot, don't you think? But when we were starting back to West Texas, he said, I'm going to have to tell my group about this because I'm due to get a 6-month chip next week. Do your groups give mementos of sobriety? And in my appalling ignorance, I said, I won't tell anyone. And he said, well, he told me that wasn't the name of the game. I tell you that because we've been married 14 years at that time, and this man had never once said to me, I'm sorry, or I was wrong, or I made a mistake. And he was, in essence, going to go down there and say it to a bunch of people he'd known 6 months. And I thought I'd go take another look at them. And it was along about now that I heard someone's invitation to Al-Anon. I used to say, I don't know why her invitation reached me when I had ignored all the others for 6 months. But I have done 3, I think, very thorough and comprehensive 4th and 5th steps. And with the very first one I did, God told me far more about myself than I was interested in knowing. And one of the insights was why I could hear her. And rigorous honesty requires that I tell you, and I wish I didn't have to. This was a woman I thought was as good as I was. I mean, I'm sorry, okay? It takes what it takes. She had everything I considered important. She had beauty and breeding and brains and status and prestige and education and money. And she still has everything I consider important. It's just a very different list tonight. See, I wanted to be the one to get him sober. He would have then owed it all to the love of a good woman. And he would have been grateful to me the rest of his life. And you may be sure I would have seen to it that he was. And that's when I began to catch on that God is not always going to use me where I want him to. And he certainly does not. We have a pamphlet in Al-Anon, Living with Sobriety, in which it says, while sobriety can be a welcome miracle, it does not guarantee happiness. We had a stormy, difficult sobriety. Charles was stark raving sober and very much aware of all of my defects of character, and he was no longer held back by guilt from mentioning them loudly and clearly and frequently. You told me that when the alcohol was gone, the ism remained, and that we certainly had the ism. My own ism was an overlay of fantasy that was hard for me to give up. You know, we are a normal family. We are. I have to tell you that I married considerably above myself. He used to say I shouldn't say that. I don't know any other way to say it. I married into a, quote, fine old family that had one time had a lot of money and still had a lot of status and prestige. And you see, there was nobody not allowed to play with me anymore. And I needed that so badly. And I was afraid that if I went down there with those people, I wouldn't have that anymore. I had prayed for help, but I thought God was showing very poor taste. This wasn't at all what I had in mind. Of course I was in bad shape. I just didn't know it. I was emotionally frozen. We're not at any competition in our fellowships as to who suffers more. But I can tell you that if someone you love with every cell of your being is killing himself, and you're watching and you're helpless to do anything about it, I will match that pain against nearly any kind I know. You can't live with pain like that, so what you do is find a way to deaden it. And I didn't realize until years later what I did. I wasn't conscious of it, but it's as if I thought feelings had valves. And I would just turn off the one marked anger, and the one marked self-pity, and the one marked resentment. And what I didn't know is that there's one valve, and it's marked feelings. And I got to you, emotionally frozen. And, up here you really know how the pain hits when something that has been frozen begins to thaw. And so I think our early recovery is often very painful as we begin to thaw out emotionally. I got to you with walls built around me. It's as if I came in with, I still see newcomers do this, as if they were encased in armor, with a shield and a sword, hostile and defensive. I no longer batter at people's defenses. I used to, let me in, I want to be your friend. I have decided that's kind of an emotional rape. What I have learned is that if we are warm and loving enough, when these people look out from the chink in their armor, sometimes their hostility eases and they put down the sword. And if we are fortunate and if God's grace is strong enough, some of them, I did, learn that they don't even need the shield anymore, that these are safe people. I had so many barriers that nearly cost me the program. I don't have time to talk to you about them. One of them was that I was a real intellectual snob. Now, I am intelligent. I am not intellectual, but I thought I was. And I thought I'd stumbled into a spiritual kindergarten. And I looked at these slogans, and if any student of mine had used them in writing, I would have written trite in the margin. I would have written cliche, So it was very hard for me to hear the program, but I began to hear it, and not all at once, and not from just one person. Let me tell you that alcoholism was not trendy in 1964. It was not the in thing to be an alcoholic. There were not treatment centers on every corner. Insurance did not pay for this treatment. There were not television announcements every 30 minutes, and nobody knew the family was sick too. There was a terrible stigma attached to being an alcoholic. I mentioned that I retired in January. For the last 7 years, I was a counselor in a little country school, and I had kindergarten through 12th grade. I had 400 kids, and if I had another hour, I'd talk to you about that. But one day I'd been visiting with a 6-year-old, and I was taking him back to his class, and he said, "My teacher's not here today." I said, "Yeah, I noticed." He said, "She's sick." I said, "Yes." And he said, "They sent another teacher." I said, "Yeah, they did." He said, "When I'm sick, they don't send another little boy." And while I explained to him that no one could learn for him, I remembered when I hoped maybe someone else could recover for me. But no other sick Al-Anon could be sent in to do it, and so I had to start learning. My group said that we don't hear the answer until we've asked the question. And I knew everything. I was opinionated beyond belief, and so I didn't ask any questions. If you have all the answers, you don't. So my sponsor said, "We can't teach somebody who already knows everything." She said, "Can you give up some of these old ideas? God can only fill an empty vessel." She said, "We can't put new wine in old bottles." And I had so much to unlearn. And here again, there's not time to tell you all of them, but let me mention a few, because I'll bet you had to unlearn these too. Well-meaning people had taught me things like God helps those who help themselves. He does not, you know. He helps those who ask. And the times I have needed him most desperately, I could not have helped myself if my life had depended on it, and it very nearly did. God helps those who ask. I was taught that mature people stood on their own 2 feet. Did you get that one? And they didn't ask anybody for help. They handled their own problems. Oh, I got that one very well. And I had a group that would say gently to me, "No, that's not so. Babies are dependent. They'll die if we don't take care of them. Adolescents are independent. I'll do it myself." They have to go through that. But mature people are very happily interdependent. We're not talking about a sick, clinging neediness here. We're talking about a very healthy acknowledgement that we have to have each other as we recover. I was taught that some pain is necessary for my spiritual education, but that misery is optional. And I don't opt for misery anymore today. I learned to ask for help. I started to say the hardest thing I did. Every time I think of a principle of the program, I think it was the hardest thing I did. If you could see my long-distance charges today, you would know that I learned to ask for help. Because if I can't make it through the night in Texas, California is still awake. And I have friends out there who say I only love them for their time zone. And if California is asleep, Hawaii is awake. And I ask for help today. I holler, ouch. I had to learn that I had not only a right to, but a responsibility for taking care of myself emotionally, that some pain can be avoided. I do not have to die on every cross tonight. And that's a freedom. I had been taught growing up that you put everyone else first and yourself last. Did you get that one? And my sponsor would say, no, that isn't necessarily true. And of course, you know how the pendulum swings from one extreme to the other, and mine did. And she'd said, "Blanche, I'm not talking about me first. I'm talking about my turn." Oh, that was, what a concept. And so I began to learn that it was all right for me to take my turn. I have a sponsor today. The one I had for 11 years moved far across the country, and I got another one. And if I had a separate hour to talk to you, I'd talk to you about sponsorship. I don't understand the kind of ego that presumes to undertake what should be a marvelous spiritual adventure and does it unguided and undirected. My sponsor says that a meeting like this is not the public level. Use her full name. Her name is Donna Lancaster. She has been my sponsor since the mid-70s. She was born with no legs. It's very hard for me to explain to her that life is unfair to me. She just, you got it. She says, once you're an adult, there are no victims, only volunteers. And she absolutely will not let me be a victim. She has feet where we have knees, and so she can walk. She can also do everything else I can do, and a great many things I cannot. She flies her own plane, for instance. She's something else. She talks all over the United States and Canada. I hope you can hear her sometime. Anyway, she has taught me, if I'm facing a challenging or difficult situation, to ask, what is in my best interests? Now, you can't do that and be a martyr. And I had suffered so nobly, nobly. I have a friend who says that it required plastic surgery to remove her hand from her forehead when she got... So once I decide what is in my best interest, the second question she has me ask is, what will enable me to like myself later? Oh, I recommend those questions. You see, I don't have to like any situation, but it is imperative that I like me in it. This got me through a very painful divorce a few years ago. I don't regret one word I said or one thing I did. And that's a good way to feel, because I kept thinking, what will enable me to like myself later? And I would not change any of it. I was taught growing up, maybe you were too, what you don't know won't hurt you. Did you get that one? What I didn't know nearly destroyed 4 people. What you don't know can kill you. And so, incident by incident, 124 hours at a time, I began to catch on to what you were saying. And I became greedy for this program. I didn't want to settle for a spiritual Band-Aid. I didn't want to settle for the crumbs, when the banquet was spread. And so I began to learn some spiritual laws to replace the rigid rules I've been following all those years. The spiritual laws are much harder and much more exacting and demanding. For instance, it's much easier for me to stay in the speed limit and not cheat on my income tax than it is to love you unconditionally. But I do that tonight because I choose to. You have no choice in it whatsoever. It won't hurt you, and it's a lot of fun for me. Another spiritual law, and I don't have time to tell you all of them, but one is that the worst immorality is judgment. And that is my most glaring defect. And either I have not been willing for God to remove it, or He hasn't chosen to. Which do you think? And I can only tell you that I'm aware today when I'm doing it. And the only reason I am is that when I start saying things like, well, you'd never catch me doing, you will. God hands me that situation to handle. And I'm not going to take a fifth step with you up here, but believe me, I try to watch it today instead of saying, I don't ever, because I do. And I get handed these on a regular basis. Of course, you taught me about releasing. What they said was, if you don't like the warts, let go of the frog. I didn't like the warts. I didn't like the person I had become. Releasing. Well, sometimes even today I have to withdraw emotionally before I can release it all. See, back then I would have turned him over to the Ku Klux Klan or the Communist Party or anyone that would have taken him. And my sponsor said, no, you release with love. And after all these decades, it still takes me a while sometimes. Sometimes I have to release with anger before I can with love. And everything I've ever released in my life has claw marks all over it. But I'm better than I used to be. I learned from you that God could work directly through my husband and children and later on through the people I sponsored. I didn't know that. I thought He had to come through me. I had always told them God's will for their lives. They didn't even have to ask. That's a real symptom of untreated Al-Anonism, is to rush in and rescue. Most of the time today, I can listen to your feelings without telling you what to do. I sit on my hands and I bite my tongue, but most of the time I can do it. I quit translating. Did you ever translate? Honey, what your daddy meant was. I thought you did. I decided they could slug it out toe to toe the best they could. We have a son and daughter. They were in Al-Anon for 10 years each. If you gave me a chance in those early years, I would tell you how much their father had damaged these children. And I had a group that made me look at how I had damaged them. And I thought I could not stand it. You see, I had a choice in all those years. I could go or stay. Those kids had no choice. I damaged them because for the first 10 years of their lives, they were programmed by an enraged mother. I would change that if I could. I cannot. I was told that I not only had to accept the woman I was back then, but I had to learn to love her. She did the best she could at her level of enlightenment. And I was told there would be no recovery as long as I felt that kind of self-hatred and remorse. But the worst damage I did them was by denial. My children, like yours, are brilliant and sensitive and aware, and kids are intuitive. And of course they knew something was wrong. And when they turned to this woman to whom they should have been able to turn for the truth under any circumstances, I said, well, darling, everything's all right. Why, no, why would you think there's something wrong at our house? Now, I submit to you that if that happens to you as a child, you grow up doubting your reason, doubting your judgment, or believing, as my daughter says, that anyone who loves you will lie to you. And it seems very natural when they do. I heard you saying that we don't give advice. Before I leave the subject of Al-Anones, there will be a special place in heaven. When I'm in California, I say an especially beneficial karma for Al-Anon sponsors. They helped undo some of the god-awful damage that we did our kids. I have tremendous love and respect for them. You told me we didn't give advice, and I thought, well, you can't help anybody. And, you get these things slowly. I began to learn that what you do is help people see their available options. You see, when I got to you, I thought I had 3 options. I could divorce Charles, I could live with him while we both tried to recover in our programs, or I could have a close, warm, loving, communicative marriage. And unfortunately, I opted for number 3, and that was not one of my available options. I hope it is one of yours. It was not. And to this day, anytime I'm miserable, I have opted for something that is just not an available option for me. And I need you to help me see what they are, and maybe more importantly, what they are not. This is what my sponsor still does for me most of all. She will say, okay, if you do this, what will the consequences be? Well, how do you feel about that? Could you live with those? Sometimes, you see, it's which kind of pain can you live with best. It's easy enough to make the decisions between good and bad, between joy and grief. But sometimes it's which kind of pain can you live with best. I began to get my responsibilities straight when I learned that I was not responsible for his drinking, and I certainly was relieved to hear that. He said I was. I don't think he thought so. And so I believed everything he told me. And I was feeling such relief, and in the next breath I was told, on the other hand, you're entirely responsible for your own behavior. I didn't want to hear that. You were taking away my whipping boy, my scapegoat. Next to an alcoholic, anybody looks good. We were in that first year, and people were praising him, and they were saying, 30 days, Charlie, way to go. 90 days, hang in there. Nobody was praising me. They were hinting rather broadly that I could use some help. And nobody had ever done this to me in my life. I finally got my responsibilities straight there. And today I see it as a freedom. Because if my happiness depended on someone else or my behavior, then I would be really powerless over myself. And because it depends on me, I can do something to change it. And I couldn't if it depended on you. See, I was in emotional slavery and didn't know it. You taught me to respond rather than react. I see that's one of your workshop topics. I think that's great. If Charles got angry, I got angry. If he got depressed, I got depressed. I thought this meant we were close. It's as if I waked up every morning and said to him, "Good morning, how do I feel today?" And I was taught, you can take your sails out of his wind, and neither he nor anyone else need determine the direction in which you go. That's another freedom, you see. Now, to choose to be the person I am was emotionally expensive for me. I had been very careful. I have to say, this isn't in my notes, I don't know how to tell you. I had tried, all the years we were married, to be the perfect wife. I wanted Charles to think that I was wise and wonderful all the time. I saw to it that he didn't see me when I wasn't. I had severe incapacitating migraine, and I used to stagger to my feet about 5 in the afternoon and say to the children, "Let's don't mention this to Daddy. You know how he worries." And when I learned from you that you can't be phony in one area of your life and be who you are in the other areas, it's like, I was told it was like a sock in the wash. You know, you just can't separate it. It touches all the rest of your life. And so I began to be who I was, and he wasn't prepared for that. I take full responsibility for having been phony up until then. When I say being who I am, I must remember that my sponsor said that's within the bounds of love and courtesy. I cannot ride roughshod over you and say, well, that's just how I am. You know, you get a Charles Manson when you do that. But within love and courtesy, I can't be phony anymore, and the price was high. It cost me a marriage. It probably won't be that high for you, but I will submit to you tonight that being phony costs more. And that was a hard lesson to learn. You told me that God was the source and that people are the channels, and that only God can provide certain things. People cannot give me total understanding, total love, total acceptance. God can do that. And it's not anyone's assignment to make me happy. I don't acquire squatter's rights on anyone's life because I married it or gave birth to it. I did not learn these things all at once. I learned them very slowly through, blood, sweat, and tears. As I said, incident by incident. And there are still days when I think, what program? God who? And I can always call one of you and you will tell me what program and God who. Usually in the words I've used with you, don't do that to me. I absolutely hate it when someone says, well, as you've told me. I learned that I don't have to be perfect. I don't know that yet at a gut level, but I know it up here. I learned that practice makes progress long before it was in our new Al-Anon book. I learned that recovery is progressive too. The weller we get, the weller we can get. English teachers are allowed to make up their own words. It's in our contract. And I had to give myself permission to have relapses. Now, unlike alcoholics, our relapses don't end us up in jail and hospitals, but we have them. My favorite story of mine took place 5 or 6 years ago. I was in Dallas visiting my son, and I have had several kinds of arthritis since childhood, and I have a knee that buckles sometimes, and we were going down the stairs outside his condo, and the knee buckled, and I fell. It was a very bad fall. I was unconscious. He called the paramedics. They came and got me and took me to the emergency room of a hospital. Now, I don't remember any of that. I came to, though, in time to hear the emergency room nurse. They were lifting me, from the stretcher in the ambulance to the gurney in the emergency room, and she was saying, now just lay back and take deep breaths. And coming out of total oblivion, I said, honey, that's lie back. I will lie back and take... When I passed out again, but when I came to, I could not shut up. I said, "You see, dear, you say it so many times every day, you really must learn to say it correctly." My son had put his hands over his eyes. He said, "She doesn't do this to total strangers usually. Really, she doesn't." Fortunately, the nurse thought it was funny. But my point in telling you is, let my defenses get down, and I'm going to straighten out the world. You know what program? God, who? And of course I talk the talk better than I walk the walk. Of course I do. And I walk the walk better than I feel the feeling. But I'm still the best Blanche that I have had. And I live on the growing edge, you know, just like the rankest newcomer. What I'm learning is just as new and scary to me. I'm facing things all the time that I've never faced before. And I need a hand to hold while I look around corners, you know. And I've never reached out, so there hasn't been one of your hands there for me. I watch new people today come in and they hit the program running. And they learn more in a year than I learned in 5. I want to tell you why. 29 years ago, we didn't have us. Right. My first sponsor had 13 months in the program. I thought she knew everything. I didn't know anyone with 5 years or 10, and Al-Anon hadn't been around for 20. I think it's exciting to be in on beginnings. We had 1 hardback book and about 10 pamphlets. And I'm grateful that today you have so much more than that waiting for you, but it didn't just happen. It came about, you know, through a lot of hard work and prayer. Well, I have to tell you about the children. They're fine, I think. Thank you. And I mean literally thank you. Both my children have been married and divorced. My daughter is a journalist. She's political editor of the St. Petersburg Times in Florida, which was always her other home. This is a very large and prestigious newspaper, which you don't know if you're not in journalism, and I'm not, but she told me so. Last fall, she was one of 6 journalists in the entire United States to be selected for a fellowship of her Asian studies. And tomorrow she finally flies back to St. Petersburg after 10 weeks of trying to learn some things about Asia and writing stories about them. She went, it seemed to me, nearly everywhere and had a wonderful time. She was married some years ago, and I love to tell about her wedding, so I will. Because, see, it's all your fault. It was in that subversive organizationality that she learned to be who she is. And she said to her father and me, there is no rule that says your attendant at a wedding has to be a girl. And I want my brother to stand with me. And before I could give them the benefit of my wisdom, her brother said, well, that's really neat. I've never been a bride's person before. The groom said, well, in that case, you're way ahead of me. I really am closer to my sister than I am my brother, and it will balance the wedding party if I ask her. So we had a best woman and a man of honor. And it was a beautiful wedding, and I sat there crying, as the mother of the bride is allowed to do, thinking sobriety made this possible. My son is a commercial photographer in Dallas. For years, before I had to go through secretaries to get to him, both these kids are very successful. They make a great deal of money, and they get awards. And I tell you that because, and I have their permission to say this, I would trade 20 points of their IQ for the ability to sustain intimate relationships. But that's not one of my available choices. My son has won 2 Clios, which is the highest award you can win in advertising. And he was the first person out of New York or another country to win them as freelance, not with an agency. And you know they wrote about him a lot in the Dallas papers and trade journals, and they never once put a comma after his name and said, the son of. But see, you told me what the source is, and I knew that's where his talent came from and not his mother and father. For many years before airlines were deregulated, so if you left Texas, you went to Dallas first, and then you flew to wherever you were going. We used to say that when you died, before you went to heaven or hell, you'd go to Dallas first. And I had hours between planes then. Now I'm lucky if I have 30 minutes. I get all my exercise sprinting through airports. But he used to come out and spend these hours with me. And we date the people we meet, and he meets models. And so he would always have one of these gorgeous young creatures on his arm. They all weighed 36 pounds and had legs up to their armpits. And I told him if I wanted to feel dowdy, I could stay home and iron, you know. My children have never done any drugs or drinking. I have reared two classic enablers, two quintessential caretakers. My daughter says that if you put her down in a room full of 1,000 men dressed just alike and one is dysfunctional, she'll find him. Why not? Her mother always did. My son used to bring home hitchhikers, provided they were 5'2" and, 36, 24, 36. He brought them home. Caretakers. And they have all the problems that kids have who grow up in alcoholic homes. The difference is they know that there's help available. They know where to get it. Most of the time they choose to get some. That's really their story. And I don't feel free to tell you about that. Just know that they haven't gotten off scot-free. I learned from you that there are ebbs and flows in all relationships, parent-child, friend-friend, lovers, husband-wife. And I don't panic anymore when a relationship ebbs. But that's because I assume it will come back. The tide will come back in. In 1988, my son decided that he would do better if he didn't have any relationship with his family anymore. This was absolutely, totally unexpected. This was my loving and attentive child. And I, of course, hoped it would be for a few months, and it has been 5 years. And I have not seen him. And he does not open my letters or talk to me on the phone. I don't know anything more painful than losing a child. And so I'm shameless about asking for what I need. And what I need is for you to help me pray for the healing of this relationship. He is not angry with me. If he were drinking, I'd have some understanding, of it. He has serious, incapacitating depressions. And as I said, that's his story. In 1980, Charles and I lost our marriage for a variety of reasons that it would not be appropriate for me to go into up here. But you had told me that marriages made in sickness do not always survive health. And ours did not. Because people who love us want to know. I always say, no, he did not leave me for another woman. I would have killed them both, and I would have been in a penitentiary, and you'd have another speaker tonight. And no, I did not throw him out for another man. And no, he did not resume drinking. He would have had 24 years sobriety in July of 1988, but he died in April of that year from lung cancer, oat cell carcinoma. He died smoking 4 packs a day. I was astonished at the intensity of my grief and the time it took me to begin to feel healed from mourning. But back to the divorce, our roads of recovery had taken us, in different directions. And I don't know why, something toxic happened when we tried to relate to each other that did not happen when we related to other people. We could not gain any further recovery in the framework of a marriage that was damaged beyond repair, that was sick beyond healing. It was not a lack of love. When he was dying, the last words we said to each other over the telephone were, "I love you." But if you haven't lived this long without learning that love is not always enough, you haven't been paying attention. It takes more than loving. We were not friends, but no one was wearing a black hat. There was no villain. You see, friends share feelings. Friends joy in each other's presence. If we could have done that, we could have stayed married. Nobody wants divorce. It's not in anyone's game plan. And yet I never felt more direct guidance than when I decided that I too would go to any lengths to get well. After 30 years, it's like an amputation. It may be necessary for survival, but the agony is intense. And there is phantom pain, where the relationship used to be. I will always regret not the divorce, but the necessity for it, as I would regret the necessity for an amputation. You told me from the very beginning that I could not back God into a corner and shake my finger in his face and say, "Why me?" After all, why not me? Instead, I was told, you ask him, "What am I supposed to understand?" And that way, suffering is not wasted. And I began to ask him. And the answers are not all in, but I have some. One is that, God and I are enough. And that was something to understand. And that I don't have to know what the future holds because I know who holds the future. And a real one for women of my generation, I am a whole person without a man. And that was something to learn. And so I began to understand as I asked. If you're in love with learning, you feel safest in school. So I began to investigate graduate schools. If you love teaching, you do a lot of counseling. And I decided I ought to get a piece of paper that said I could. And I ended up at the University of Texas in Austin, and I moved there in 1982 to go to graduate school. It was the longest, hardest master's program I ran across, okay? But I had learned that I deserved the best. I said to my children, 3 years? It was 54 hours and a thesis. I said, 3 years. Do you know how old I'll be in 3 years if I go get a master's degree? And my son said, how old will you be in 3 years if you don't? So I pulled up roots and sold my house and left my comfort zone. And you would have laughed to see me in graduate school. I kept wanting to teach the class, I knew I would be older than the other students. I wasn't prepared to be older than the professors. I had to learn that you do not pat their knee and say, "Your mother must be so proud of you." I wanted to say, "Now, honey, what the professor meant was, And I wanted to correct the professor's grammar, but I don't do that when I'm conscious. In 1985, I got that master's degree in counseling psychology, and I worked for a while at our community college, first as a counselor, and then I taught one class a week. This was after I went to work in my little country school in the daytime. I taught one class. It was a class in human sexuality. They required that it be taught by a counselor, but being interviewed for the job was interesting. How do you ascertain that someone is qualified to teach a sex class? I mean, we can't major in it in college, although you and I know people who tried. I think what got me the job was when they asked, how were you taught about sex in your family of origin when you were growing up? And I told them very truthfully that I have an aunt who is the patriarch of our family. And she used to say to my mother, when it's time to tell Blanche Marie the facts of life, let me do it. You'll make it sound entirely too exciting. My mother told me, thank you very much. Teaching a sex class was great fun. It was a marvelous class. And it was not a how-to class. There was only one chapter on that. I've missed teaching a great deal. Besides, in a sex class, the students never said what they used to say in my English classes, like, what are we learning this for? We'll never use this. Change is very hard for me. Teaching and counseling are two different processes. And I had trouble separating them for a while. The first week I was at this little country school, a mother called about her first grade boy. She said, he's having trouble on the school bus. Would you see what you can find out? So I called him into my office, darling little boy. And I said, tell me what happens on the school bus. He said, well, those kids pester me. I said, what do you do? He said, I don't use dirty words. And I said, well, I'm certainly glad. What do you do? He reached over and got my tablet. Very laboriously, tongue between the teeth, he wrote HSIT. He said, I wrote that down. I said, What happened? Well, I showed it to them. I said, yes. He said, well, they couldn't read it. Now, up until then, I was fine, but I was a fire horse hearing the bell. I said, darling, you didn't spell it right. Here, let me show you. This is the way you spell it. I was crossing the T before I thought, I don't think this is why they hired me. I thought, it is not in my job specifications that I teach obscenities to 6-year-olds. I've always hoped that when he went home that day, no one said, what did you learn in school today? And even though change is hard, I have been making some lately. I was very happy living alone. I was so surprised. I'd never lived alone. I went from mom and daddy to a dormitory, back to mom and daddy to a husband. And my daughter said, you're going to learn to like it and you won't give it up easily. And I have to say this carefully. I am not young and I have never been beautiful, but I like men a lot, and there have always been men kind enough to care for me. And so I had a very good time in those 11 years. And I was hanging out a lot the last few years of them with Bob Miller, whom I had known since we were all married and knew each other, his families. And he was very happy living alone since his divorce, too. You know what? I think maybe happy people make better husbands and wives. About once a year, we'd talk about getting married, and whoever brought it up depended on the other person to say, oh, no, things are fine the way they are. It was Halloween night in 1991, and we talked on the phone every night, and I was leaving for Tulsa. I was going to go talk, and I said, you're having your 25th AA birthday in 5 weeks, and we need to do something really special for the 25th one. Have you thought about it? And he said, I thought I might get married. Well, now, it wasn't even his turn to bring it up. And I'm rarely at a loss for words, but I almost said, to whom? And he said, I have talked to my 3 children, my accountant, my sponsor, and my lawyer, and they all think it's a great idea. I mean, is that romantic or what? How could you turn down a proposal like that? If I were 20, they would have thought I was pregnant. That was the hurried-up wedding you've ever seen. He said he didn't give me much time because, and this is true, my pattern is to read 10 or 12 books on the subject, whatever it is, write extensively in my journal, talk to a lot of people about it, and then back out. And so he didn't give me a chance to do that. He's a very ardent Episcopalian, and I've always thought they were rather aerobic myself, but, you know, I grew up Southern Baptist. You should have seen me trying to go through all that stuff. Stand, sit, kneel, stand. But I managed. We were married in his church by his minister, and there were people unkind enough to suggest that maybe they should play Amazing Grace as we walked down the aisle. Out of respect for our ages, but we did not. We were married on December 7th, and in February we bought a very beautiful new house. And in March, Bob became ill. And he was ill for quite a while. He had recurring hepatitis B, chronic liver infection. I haven't talked about this from the podium very much. And after a few months, we were told that he would not get well. We have been told we have 1 to 4 years. He is bedridden. I was committed to places like this. Some of them had asked me before he did, you know. And we talked about it. And we decided that nothing would honor our marriage more than for me to do what I can do in Al-Anon, since he can no longer do what he could do in AA. So far, God's grace is sufficient, just as he promised that it would be. I'll tell you more about it when I have ingested it more, okay? Hey, you did what I asked you to. You loved me back while I was talking, and I thank you for that. I always close with an Al-Anon promise. Did you know we had one? It, too, is in our literature. It says, today, this very moment is all you're sure of. And that flashing instant has gone to join the past even before you're aware of it. With this dizzy spin of time, the only safe way to make each moment count is to make Al-Anon responses habitual. You can't go wrong following Al-Anon's teachings. With them, there's no regret for yesterday, there's guidance for today, and there's hope for tomorrow. So that's the promise with which I leave you on this hot, sticky June night in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I can promise you no regret for yesterday, and guidance for today, and hope for tomorrow.